Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's Arcserve UDP webinar. We're specifically going to be talking about Update 2, which was a service pack, feature update pack that we've just launched in a couple of weeks ago for UDP 6.5. I'm Charlie Smith. I'm a senior principal consultant in the UK. And if you need to contact me at any point, my email address is charlie.smith@arcserve.com. So we're going to get underway, and what I'll do is I'm going to kind of go through a presentation talking about the updates in quite a lot of detail, especially around Azure, and we're going to go through a live demo as well at the end, just to kind of touch on some of the updates so you can see them in the console and what they look like. So we do have a questions panel on the GoToWebinar software, so if you want to raise a question during today's webinar, please use the questions panel, and what I'll try and do at the end is answer any questions offline to make sure. So if you do raise a question, I encourage you to stay on the webinar for an extra 5 minutes or so, just to give me time to answer your questions so you can see the answers, and I'll share all the answers and all the questions with everybody. So we're going to get underway now. So some of the new marquee or headline features for 6.5 Update 2 are our new Microsoft Cloud or Azure support. We've been able to support Microsoft Azure for a couple of years now, but what we've been doing over the last few updates is increasing functionality into Azure. So not only can we replicate your backups and recovery points into the Azure cloud, we can now actually do virtual provisioning, which is allowing you to do disaster recovery as a service. So I'll talk through how we do virtual standby for Windows and instant and virtual machine recovery for Linux in the Azure cloud. I've got quite a number of slides going into a lot of detail on that. We also enhanced some of our existing features. So we added Office 365 for Microsoft Exchange in UDP 6.5 back in February. But what we've done in this update is we've improved the back end of that capability now that we can actually deduplicate and globally dedupe all your Office 365 backups, as well as being able to deduplicate backing up NAS shares. In the previous update, we had to create a separate data store with compression enabled, but we couldn't share that data store with the rest of your on-prem backups, for example, and globally dedupe across everything. So that's now been updated, so it just makes it much easier to manage, and also significantly reduces the storage requirements to retain Office 365 and NAS share backups within UDP. We've done a number of performance improvements around UNC path backups as well, so we can provide faster incremental daily backups, and I'll talk more about that. We've also introduced auto VM protection for Hyper-V environments. We added a similar feature for VMware in UDP 6.5 Update 1 to auto assign and protect VMs in VMware, and now we're adding that same capability to Hyper-V environments as well. We've also done some nice user improvements around instant file and folder recovery straight from the UDP console. So as well as being able to browse recovery points and do a standard restore back to the original or an alternative location, you're now able to just instantly pull down files and folders straight from the UDP console, and it'll actually auto package them and zip them up for you as well. So we'll talk through that. We've also added the ability to exclude virtual disks in virtual machine backups, which again makes the backup more efficient. So we'll talk more about these points in depth as we go through the presentation. We've also done a lot of platform certifications in this release as well. So we now support, as well as Ubuntu 14.04 and 16.04 LTS, which is a 64-bit platform. We've also updated our Debian, Red Hat, CentOS, Oracle Linux releases all the way up to 7.4x. And also SUSE Linux Enterprise Server 12 SP3. We've also certified vSphere 6.5 Update 1, which is the VDDK component that we use to do agentless backup in a VMware environment, keeping up with VMware support there. Also the latest updates for Microsoft Exchange 2016. And also we've refreshed our Oracle support on Windows platforms for Oracle 11G R2 and 12C R2 on Server Windows 2012 and Server 2016 as well. SQL Server 2008 SP4 was added for Windows 2012 R2. Windows 10, the IoT Enterprise 2016 has been updated. We've also refreshed some of the components on our UDP appliance builds. So the Linux backup server, which runs as a Hyper-V VM, has been updated from CentOS 6.6 to CentOS 7.3. And that's allows our customers using our appliances to back up Linux environments and provide Linux granular recovery from the appliance. We've also introduced an update for the HPE FreePass support by supporting the latest updates of the RMC management server for the HP FreePass arrays. So a lot of platform and certification updates there. Okay, sorry, I apologize. I thought I was showing the screen. Okay, hopefully you can see it now. I apologize for that. So yeah, so we are doing a lot of updates. Just to go back to recap, you didn't see that previous slide. We're doing updates for Azure, Office 365, to dedupe Office 365 and NAS backups, performance improvements on UNC paths, auto VM protection for Hyper-V, and new restore capabilities, being able to directly download from the console and exclude virtual disks. And I've just gone through the UDP Update 2 platform certification updates. We've also done some other improvements in the product as well. Things like being able to support the new change block tracking driver for Hyper-V environments, ODX, has been added. We've continued to support the Hyper-V SMB3 feature to support incremental backups. Parallel VM restores on the same virtual proxy has now been added. Allow users to select storage policy when restoring VMs. We've also done a lot of supportability updates now. The dashboard now shows not just the backup status, but also the status of any other task that gets executed in a plan. So if a replication task has a problem or a virtual standby update or copy to tape, they're all reflected in the dashboard reports now. We've also added unique message IDs for warning and error messages in the UDP log activity logs. And this is more of a benefit for using the APIs into third-party monitoring and management tools, where each message gets a unique ID when we're extracting it through the web services APIs. We've also done other improvements, improve concurrent active nodes limit, migrate UDP console to new node. So there's now a wizard to help you drive if you need to migrate the console from, say, an appliance onto a VM or vice versa, or from one VM to another. Easy restore from the data store. Even, so for example, if you mount an offline data store from a backup taken a year ago, even though there's no active plans connected to that data store, you can restore straight from the UI for old recovery points in a data store that's been mounted, even though there's no active policies assigned with that data store. We've also added some improvements around being able to replicate replicated data. So for example, if you're an MSP and you're receiving replicated data from a customer site to your data center, you're able to add another replication task to replicate that copy to another DR resilient environment, so you can have two copies of the data in your own environment. So I'll talk through some of these improvements as well. So we're going to spend a bit of time talking about our new cloud support, our new capability that we added. I'm just going to quickly check. Yeah, that's okay. It's just making sure everybody can see the UI the presentation. So what we've done in update 2 is add the ability to do virtual provisioning into the Azure cloud. We had this capability to do this in Amazon AWS already, and it was an area that we wanted to add into the product as quickly as we could. So this gives us a new capability to offer disaster recovery as a service in the Microsoft cloud. Previously to that, we were able to replicate recovery points into Azure, either into blob storage by copying recovery points, or using RPS to RPS replication, which allows you to use that WAN optimized deduped replication into the cloud. So with this capability now, we can take a backup on an RPS, either a local RPS from your data center to provision directly into Azure, or you can replicate to a remotely managed RPS in Azure, which is optional. You don't have to deploy an RPS in Azure to do virtual standby in Azure, but a lot of customers would prefer to, efficiently replicate their recovery points into Azure first from their on-premise backups. And I don't know, somebody's unmuted their phone there. I'll just need to mute that for a second. Okay, sorry about that. Like I say, I know there are a number of questions being raised, but I will try and look into that. Okay, my sound, apologize about that. So like I say, with the virtual standby for Azure, we're able now to provision, spin up your on-prem backups into the Azure cloud, but you can also use it to back up virtual nodes in Azure, and compute and actually spin them up so everything's happening locally in the cloud as well. So I suppose there's two use cases. There's an on-prem hybrid cloud use case, which is replicating your on-prem backups into Azure and then spinning them up for disaster recovery. And then there's also a local use case where you may want to back up Azure compute and spin them up into the cloud itself, where everything's local for disaster recovery. And as I say, the RPS in Azure is an optional component. You don't have to have an RPS in Azure to make this work, but I suppose it gives you performance benefits, especially if you've got a lot of data, if you can replicate it into the cloud and all the provisioning is happening locally within the cloud. So for Linux, it's slightly different. For Linux servers, we have to use our instant virtual machine recovery. IVM allows you to basically spin up a backup directly from the backups data sitting either in your local RPS or your Azure RPS. And again, this allows you to spin up a VM quickly, but this time is we're not creating a full clone ahead of time, which is what Virtual Standby does. Virtual Standby will actually create the Azure volumes whilst your backups are replicating, but the compute will only be powered on when you invoke Virtual Standby from the console. Whereas Instant VM, you're doing it all on demand, spinning up the Linux server straight from the backup storage into Azure. So what I'm going to do now is actually talk through some of the key requirements to make this happen and make this work. So obviously the prerequisites and the configuration are, you need to have a full install of Arcserve UDP running at your local site if you want to obviously protect your on-prem environment. So that could be a UDP appliance, or it could be a software installation of Arcserve UDP on your own Windows server and storage, but essentially it would have a UDP management console, at least one RPS server, agents or agentless backups taking place across your on-prem environment. And then in Azure, you need to set up a number of prerequisite components. The first thing is you need to have an Azure Active Directory node registered in your account, and we need that to authenticate the login when we're connecting into the Azure cloud from your on-prem environment. You also need to have a virtual standby monitor server. If you're planning to deploy an RPS in Azure, then that server itself can be the monitor server. If you don't have an RPS in Azure, then obviously you would have to have a VM running that. It could be your Azure Active Directory server or any other Windows VM running in Azure. You need to have a resource group set up within your Azure account, which will basically consist of a storage account and networking and other components as well. And we need that to be in place to be able to connect in to the environment to do the provisioning. And I'll show you some screenshots in a minute of how that's set up. And again, optional, but if you do want to deploy an RPS server into Azure, we recommend a server type called the DSV2, which is optional, and this is a sort of standard, well-spec'd VM node that you can deploy into Azure, which has all the required components. The only thing that you will need to add is the disks, obviously for the backup data, their page blob volumes. They tend to be added into Windows storage spaces at 1 terabyte volume increments, and using Windows storage spaces on that Azure node, you can add the capacity to the desired level. Also, you need to calculate how much faster hard disk drives and SSDs you need for the dedupe databases, etc. And we can help our customers run calculations to provide those detailed specifications around SSD requirements and faster disk drives for the things like the dedupe indexes and the data volumes that would be required on that Azure instance as well. So when we're doing the connectivity, as I've mentioned already, we need to have a resource group in place, which will give us, the resource group will give us a location region, the storage account, the virtual network, and the subscription ID. So these all have to be in place, and obviously we need to have an Active Directory application running, and that will give us a directory ID for the Azure AD as well. So once all these are in place, we can then connect in and register that account. So when you're in UDP, this could be the RPS server running in Azure, or it could be your local one. If you're planning to do it directly from your local on-prem recovery point server, you would add a virtual standby task directly after a backup task. So your task 1 would be your backup, and then task 2 would be virtual standby to connect into Azure. If you had an RPS server in Azure, you would basically create a UDP server and an RPS running in Azure, and from your first server, you would basically create a task to replicate to a remotely managed RPS, and then the task 1 on your RPS server running in Azure would have a replicate from a remotely managed RPS task, and then after that you would add the virtual standby task. And the third option, as I've mentioned there, is that if you were planning to back up compute within Azure itself, you would have task 1, which is backup, if you're going to an RPS in Azure, and then task 2 would be virtual standby. So there's different ways you can do it. You can either have a virtual standby task running directly after a backup task, or if you're replicating from an on-prem recovery point server into Azure, you would have the virtual standby task set up after task 1, which would be a replicate from a remotely managed RPS. And again, there's a lot to take in today in this presentation, but we can go through this in more detail if you do it. And this is about creating the resource group in Azure now. One of my colleagues, Carl Green, actually set this up to test it, make sure it was all working. And the key thing here is that this resource group all has to be set up in the same location. So the the virtual network and network security group have to be all in the same environment with your storage account. So that's really key. So this was set up in the UK South Azure data center. So it's all within the UK, but obviously depending where you're connecting in from around the world, you would select your local Azure environment, which is nearest to yourselves. Okay, so once you've done that, the next tab is, selecting Azure from the menu for your virtual standby. And then when you go into the virtual machine, it gives you the virtual machine sizes, and there's different sizes of templates that you can select from Azure for your compute. So in that virtual machine size, there's a drop-down list, and there's different templates that you can select. You obviously have to give the VM a prefix, which is identifying it as a DR copy. Carl, who set this screenshot up, he used his own name plus UDP VM underscore followed by the VM name. But that prefix can be anything that you want it to be. It could be a location prefix, so you could say, for London, LON underscore followed by the VM, or if it was Manchester, it could be MAN underscore. So where the VMs originate from on premise. Obviously, if it was all within Azure itself, you could create a local prefix to your type. Then you would add in your storage account name, your virtual network from your resource group, etc., and the network security group as well. And all these would have to be configured before you actually go and create the virtual standby task. So essentially, once all that's saved and updated, and you run your next backup, the virtual standby task will automatically kick in. And what you'll notice is to begin with, the VHDs, which are basically the hard drive files, get created under the user's Azure storage account under the user's resource group. So if you go in there, you'll see the disks being added, which is basically the disks we've created, which is basically a mirrored copy of the recovery point data that's been backed up, and obviously a cloned copy of the hard drives, which you're basically backing up and replicating into the cloud. It's not actually until you provision the VM into Azure that the actual compute then gets seen and registered under your user's resource group. So in the next screenshot here, you can see that once you start virtual standby from the UDP console, that the compute then gets registered and powered on into Azure. So we're not actually, the nice thing is we're not using compute whilst virtual standby tasks are running. It's only when you have to invoke DR that the compute actually gets spun up. Obviously, we've designed it like that because there is a cost implication of running VMs in the Microsoft cloud. So you really don't want to be running the VMs until you actually need them. So we can power them on, from the UDP console, and then the VM will be powered on into the Azure environment. And the next screenshot is just showing you how all the networking is working. We basically convert all the network settings, and you would have to configure the virtual network group so your IP addresses, etc., would work in an Azure environment. And that we do have documentation on how to set up all of these tasks. And essentially the idea is you can do a remote desktop connection to that machine and ping and make sure it's all working, etc., once it's been provisioned into Azure. So it's pretty straightforward to set up. I know a number of my pre-sales colleagues have been testing this with our Microsoft MSN accounts internally to make sure it's all working, and everything looks great with this update, and it's all working fine. Obviously, to stop a virtual standby task, when you go into the UDP console, the first thing it asks you is, do you want to delete the attached disks associated with that VM? If you were doing a test and you wanted to kind of blow the whole thing away, then you would say yes. In a normal scenario, I would expect a customer to say no at this point, because if this was a DR clone that, it's taken a number of, a bit of time to create these virtual hard drives in Azure, the last thing you want to do is delete them, because it would have to then recreate them all from scratch. So you would probably say no to that, to power off the VM. The compute would disappear from the Azure Resources tab, but the virtual hard drives under the resource group would stay available. Also, from a monitoring perspective, if no VM is created, the VM status will always show not applicable. So when you're actually monitoring the VMs or the virtual standby VMs, it will say not applicable because you've not actually started any compute. When you provision or start the virtual standby task, it will tell you that the VM is running. If you stop the VM through the Azure portal, then you'll see that this virtual standby VM is powered off, but it's still available, that can be powered on at any point in time. So you can actually monitor what's going on through the UDP console for your VMs or your virtual standby clones that are being created and being kept up to date in the Azure cloud. And as I say, for Linux and VMs, we can't do virtual standby because virtual standby is only available for Windows. But with Linux, we can do instant VM restore, which is a pretty straightforward process. You basically right-click a Linux node, physical or virtual, that's been backed up, and you right-click the server and say create an instant VM. You then select the location as Microsoft Azure. And then it will spin it up, and you'll have to register all your storage location and your credentials similar to the virtual standby task to be able to connect into Azure and spin that up. And again, that can be from an RPS on-prem or an RPS running in the Azure cloud. So just to summarize, virtual standby and instant VM to Azure allows cost-effective business continuity disaster recovery for Azure customers. This is really a kind of no-brainer if you're a company that already has invested in the Microsoft cloud. It's really, you will have people who are familiar with provisioning and creating virtual machines in the cloud. From a commercial perspective, you will already have a cost model, worked through your partner into the Microsoft cloud. So using us to provide disaster recovery as a cloud is no great thing, but it helps organizations to leverage the cloud in a better way to provide DR as a service from your on-prem environment using Arcserve UDP. But as I mentioned before, it can also be used to protect Azure Compute. We can deploy a UDP agent onto Azure Compute, back it up to an RPS in the cloud, and the virtual DR as a service can also be used to spin them up locally as well. It also allows for customers looking at stronger levels of protection against ransomware to give you an air-gapped copy of your data, because the challenge is if you're backing up to disk on-prem, there's always a small risk that the ransomware could attack the backup server, and if you've only got one copy of the data, that means you're vulnerable. Obviously, for a lot of customers, tape creates a good air-gap copy of your data for ransomware attacks, but a lot of customers are reluctant to kind of go back to using tape again. So cloud is a good alternative to do that, where you're connecting into a completely separate security model, separate environment. There's virtually no chance of any virus being able to get from your on-prem environment into the cloud, because it's a completely separate security management to connect in. So it's a proper air-gapped environment. And as I said to you before, you can leverage your existing Azure relationship and investment. And really, from a technological perspective, it's really clever what we do. We're converting your data into Microsoft Azure VM format. But the good thing is we're only powering on the compute when you actually need to invoke it for DR. Until then, we've just basically converted the VHD files, so they're ready to be spun up into a compute. But whilst the virtual standby tasks are running, there's no compute other than the recovery point server. If you decide to deploy an RPS in Azure, that's the only compute that would be running. Okay, so other things that we've done. So as I mentioned before, we've added a lot of new updates to our Linux distributions for Ubuntu, SUSE, Red Hat, Oracle Linux, Debian, CentOS, etc. So we're supporting all the latest updates now for Linux platforms. It's fair to say that most of our customers are quite Windows-centric, but we do have a lot of customers that have got Linux distributions in their environment that they need to back up and protect. So we've got really strong support for Linux platforms now, probably the best we've ever had in terms of different Linux distributions. Also, when a Linux system is running as a VM, we can pretty much back up any Linux variant out there. If it's physical Linux, then obviously we have a set list of certificated platforms ranging from Ubuntu, Debian to Red Hat platforms covering CentOS, Red Hat, and Oracle Linux, SUSE Linux as well. But they're the main ones that we see, the sort of in production environments. We've also added, as I mentioned, updates to all the various versions of VMware Exchange and other platforms as well. And this really helps our customers allow them to upgrade their environment for business purposes. Also, obviously, with threats to ransomware and viruses and malware, it's important that your environment is kept up to date, because there's the security updates and everything getting rolled into these new versions of applications, databases, and platforms. So again, it's really important that your backup solution supports all the latest updates, so you're not held back because your backup software doesn't support the environment that you need to protect. As I've mentioned, we've had Office 365 protection in UDP 6.5 now for quite a while, coming up for a year now. But what we've done in 6.5 update 2 is that the data that we back up from Office 365 can now be globally deduplicated with the rest of your backup data into the same data store. A data store is basically a storage pool on disk that we manage from our recovery point server. Prior to update 2, you had to create a separate data store with dedupe switched off to be able to back up Office 365, which meant we could only compress the data and not globally dedupe the data. You could replicate that data store to a data store with dedupe enabled, but the initial data store that the data was landed in had to have compression only and dedupe switched off. Now with update 2, however, that's all changed, and we can now have a central data store where you can have your physical virtual backups, your Windows, your Linux, your NAS shares, your Office 365, all backing up. So that's kind of what we've added now in update 2, that we can now globally deduplicate. And when this is just showing you the activity log there, where it will tell you how much data was written to the backup destination and how much data was saved by deduplicating and compressing the backups. So, you know, we're basically being able to squeeze down your Office 365 backup data to a much smaller size using the new capability in update 2. And this is really good because we do have a lot of customers now backing up NAS shares and Office 365 who will really welcome the fact that they can now significantly reduce the backup sizes of these backups. With the compression, it was pretty good, don't get me wrong, but now with the data deduplication as well, we're able to really reduce both NAS backups and Office 365 backups on disk. Again, with the auto VM protection, we added this capability to VMware in update 1 for UDP 6.5, but in update 2, you can now do the same thing for Hyper-V VMs for agentless backup. You can basically select the parent folders containing the VMs in the various locations in your Hyper-V clusters or your Hyper-V hosts. And the idea is that any new VMs that get added will get auto backed up. Any VMs that get removed will get auto removed from the backup policy. It's all about creating a more easy to use environment that you're not having to automatically, deploy new VMs to the business and then think, oh, has anybody updated the backup software? And then I have to go into the plan, modify the plan, add the new VMs, remove the old VMs that are no longer there. And that's additional admin tasks that, that a busy IT guy would rather not have to do. He's having to manage other projects and work on other things. So it's just about making the solution self-manage itself better. And we've now got consistent functionality across both VMware and Hyper-V environments for auto VM protection. And as it says in the bullet points there, we can work at a cluster level, a hypervisor level, or a storage level. So you can select at different levels to auto assign VMs for auto protection. A nice feature also that we've added is the ability to exclude virtual disks from the backup as well. In UDP 6.5, we were able to back up VMware and Hyper-V, but if you had volumes on a VM that you didn't really need to back up, it maybe didn't hold any business critical data, we just backed up everything on the VM, regardless if it was valuable or not. So with the VMware API and the Hyper-V API backups that we did for agentless protection, it would auto back up everything on a VM. So now you can basically hit a configure button next to each VM in your backup source, and it will then show you what volumes are available on each VM. and you can select which volumes you want to exclude, not include, exclude from the backup. So you select those and say okay, and then when the backup runs to do the agentless backup, it will only back up the volumes that you want to include, and the excluded volumes are obviously excluded and not protected. So this is a nice enhancement. We've had a lot of customers asking for this, and it's good that we've now added this into the product. And again, when you're doing granular recovery of files and folders on physical or virtual machines, the default way to do that in UDP is to do right-click a server, select Restore, and then select Browse Recovery Points. You then select the date on the calendar, the recovery point you want to recover from, and then you would open up the volume. It would mount that from the backup and present the volumes on that NTFS volume to you that you could then restore from. Now you will notice that there is like a next to each folder, even when you open up a volume to subfolders, there's like a blue download icon on the right hand side of the UI that can be selected. And if you select that at the appropriate level, whatever you have selected will be zipped up and downloaded straight away through the console UI. And this is quite a nice useful feature, because it could be that you've had a request come in, someone just wants the files back quickly in a hurry. You can download them as a zip file and leave that on a share for someone to collect, or you can attach it to an email and send it to the user as well. And also ideal for quick recoveries for ransomware, to ability to go back in time and recover file versions quickly. You may not necessarily want to recover the file because it could contain encrypted data or a virus, but you could basically download it as a zip file and then get your antivirus solution to scan it to make sure it's not infected. And then it's a safe way to bring back data if you're not sure what versions are affected or infected by a ransomware attack. So it's a nice way to do that. So it can pull them down very quickly. Other additional features that we've added is for UNC CIF shares. Our development team have done some real good performance improvements. Our solution was pretty good before, but obviously as a company, we're Hi, I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened there. I seem to have lost connection to the GoToWebinar software. It just seemed to log me out for no reason. Hopefully you can hear me now. I'll just make sure that everybody can before I start. So we're going to crack on with this. Okay, so sorry about that. So as I've mentioned, we've added improvements to do NAS backups to improve the performance, to do incremental scans, to calculate what files have changed in a more efficient way. So that's been introduced with update 2. We've also added the ability to recover ACL files. Cool. So I've just got verification that everything's back on track. We've also added an improvement to recover ACL files when we're doing restore of NAS shares as well. In the last update, unfortunately, we did have a few customers complain about the fact that the security attributes of files weren't preserved when we restored them. So that's now been introduced as an update, as an enhancement to an existing feature. And as I said before, which you probably didn't hear me because I didn't realize my audio had switched off and everything else, is that we've introduced the ability to incorporate VMware or vCenter storage policies when you're recovering drives for a VM level restore. So this is a nice feature that just to make sure that your recovery adheres to the storage policies that you've defined in your vCenter. And as mentioned, we've now added the ability to monitor all tasks from the dashboard, not just the backup tasks as per the previous update. So any tasks that you add to your data protection plans, could be a replication task or a restore or a virtual standby task or a copy to tape or whatever it is, a DR test, they're all monitored in addition to the backups. So you get a more accurate representation of your data protection status as opposed to your backup status with the all-encompassing monitoring that we now do. And also for what we've done to improve our web service APIs is that we offer a unique message ID now to any event created in the activity log. So basically, in the old update, the message ID was the same for all messages, which meant if we were trying to capture key messages to export into a remote monitoring management solution, it made it more difficult. So we've now provided unique message IDs to allow third-party monitoring and management tools to better incorporate into our web services. And this is a new feature that we added as well, which is that you can now do restores from imported data stores that may have been backed up and offline for various reasons. We do have some customers, for example, that every 12 months they create a new data store and archive off the old data store and almost start afresh. So they've got a full year's worth of backups that they can archive off to tape or whatever. So if there was a requirement to recover, for example, an end of year backup or an old set of data, you could basically recover that data, import the data store. At that point, the old data store doesn't have any backup plans on nodes, active nodes associated with it. But you can now right click it and select restore against a VM or any backup node that's been backed up into that data store and do a recovery from it. So it's just about creating different use cases around our software and providing more flexibility to restore even from a data store that's not active or it's been brought back from a DR scenario to recover data. And again, this is another improvement similar to the last one that, we had a lot of managed service providers that were saying, look, we receive data from various customers that they bring into our cloud for disaster recovery, but we want to provide a more resilient backend where we can replicate the customer's data to a DR recovery point server in our own environment, just in case our main recovery point server fails. So now, if you've got a task to replicate from a remotely managed RPS, which is the incoming replication task that you have to create on a remote RPS server receiving replicated data, you can then add a replicate to a remotely managed RPS task after that, which you couldn't do before update 2. So this now then allows a customer to receive data from a replication task into a separate RPS data store, and then take that image and replicate it somewhere else for resilience or disaster recovery protection. So that's now been added into the product. It could be that, you know, you replicate from one data store to another, and from the second data store you send a copy off to the cloud, which could be a very valid use case, you know. So it's about, again, providing more functionality and flexibility around our software to do more advanced use cases. Okay, so I've covered a lot of stuff. I apologize for that interruption during the webinar there. No idea why it threw me out like it did, but it kind of left me in disarray for 5 minutes until I could work out how to connect back in. But just to let you know that there's a lot of information available on our website. If you go to arcserve.com UK, there's various case studies that we've done with customers, white papers, data sheets. You can actually try UDP 6.5 update for free if you're a new customer and want to have a look at our software around backup and restores. Obviously, I didn't give a full recap of the full product capability today. It was really just to focus on the new features and enhancements that we've added in update 2. If you are an existing customer, the update 2 can be downloaded from the UDP console. You just go into the help menu on the right hand side of the console and select check for updates, and it will detect update 2 and ask if you want to download it. The other option, of course, is if you want to do an offline update, you can go to our support site, which is our Zendesk support site. The easiest way to get to there is to type arcserve.com/support. That will take you to our Zendesk support page. You then can select Arcserve UDP, then Arcserve UDP 6.5 solutions and patches, and that will take you into our patch page. You can select update 2 and download. But to download the patch or the full remastered image, which you can also download, you need to have a Zendesk logging account already created, so you can log in to get the download links and download the updates. So that's available there as well. We also do appliance testing, so we do a try and buy on our appliances, and our UDP update 2 image has already been incorporated into the new builds of our appliances. So any customer buying a new appliance now will have update 2 already pre-installed and loaded onto the appliance already. So what I'm going to do now is just a little demo just to go through some of the new features that we've talked about in the presentation, so we can have a look at that. And what I'll do is I'll actually go through at the end of this any questions that have been raised that haven't already been answered, other than the people shouting out saying we can't hear you, and those obviously I won't be updating those ones, but everything else I will try and do. So at this stage I'm going to move across to my VMware lab. You should be able to see my UDP console now. And for anybody that hasn't installed update 2 yet in their environment, you'll notice that there is a bit of a change in the UDP dashboard. That is the RTO reports, which are our SLA profiles, have been moved automatically from pie charts into bar graphs. The information is still the same. It still shows the same information, but we've now presented it in a bar chart format. The feedback from our customers is that they would prefer it in this format. Makes it easier to understand what servers have been recovered or restored, and again, all these link straight back into the reporting. So if I click on that dashboard, it will then take me into the report, so I can see the metrics behind. You know, I did a BMR on a small Windows server there. It actually only took 4 minutes to do the recovery, you know, which is well within my SLA. That's why it's green. So I've not had any SLAs fail in my storage lab, you know. But realistically, in the real production world, you may have VMs or servers that you've recovered that have been restored successfully, but they've taken longer than the desired SLA. You know, you may have a 4-hour SLA to do a VM level restore. If the restore takes 5 hours because it's a really large VM, you know, that would be an example of how you could breach an SLA, and it would mark that in the dashboard. Obviously, we have faster ways to recover around virtual standby and instant VM recovery, but if you were doing a restore in the traditional sense, we can monitor that as well. And then obviously, as I mentioned in the presentation, the backup status is not just the backup status anymore. It's monitoring the status of all these various tasks. So you're getting a true reflection of the data protection status, not just the backup status in your environment. Because, for example, if you were backing something up and the backup was successful, but then the subsequent replication task failed to replicate the data off-site, that would be a cause for concern, and you'd want to know about that. So we can now monitor all the various tasks. Now, in the resources tab, some of the difference at this stage is you can't see any differences, but when you start to go into things like plans, this is where you will notice a plans difference. So, for example, we added that feature to exclude disks. So I can go into this, for example, I have a VM here, I can configure that, and I can go in and say, okay, there's 2 volumes associated with this server. I may want to exclude one of the volumes. So in a second, when this loads up, you can see there that I've auto excluded the second volume on this server because it doesn't have any business critical data on it. And I've just decided to exclude it from the backup. So that's the exclusion there. Also, when you're adding VMs now, we already added a feature for VMware in the last update. So for VMware now, you can connect in, but not just to your hosts and clusters. You can back up things like VM templates. So if you've got template groups, you know, that you want to back up, you can back up the virtual templates. You can now back up tag groups. And I have a Linux tag in my vCenter, for example, but it doesn't matter what it is. You can basically, there's a number of ways now to discover and tag VMs for backup. So this is now looking at tags, you know, and you can add something like that, you know. So the idea is that we've got different ways to recover, but what I was going to show you here was the Hyper-V one now. So for Hyper-V, it's a slightly different user interface for discovery. And you can go in here, and this is where you could select. So with me now, I could just select that, and any VM getting created or deleted in my Hyper-V host would get auto-designed into the backup, etc. So you can do all that. My storage lab isn't the best environment to show you some of these new features because I don't have a cluster and things like that. But in a production environment, you would see some of these enhancements. Now, around restores as well, we've added the ability, for example, when we want to do a restore on a VM, you know, I would right-click a server and select restore. And, you know, I can go in now. When I select browse recovery points now, you'll notice in a second when it loads up. It's just taking a second to load up. Okay, I don't know what's happened to that one. I'll pick another node here, sorry. Restore. Okay, so now when I select browse recovery points and I select a volume, you'll see that now that we have these download buttons next to the download. So if I was restoring this folder and it's got this set of files, obviously I could go through a normal scenario and restore back to the original location, but I can now just select this folder here, and it says preparing download, and you'll see now that it's just getting pulled down as a zip file into the console. And if I then click on that file, open it up, there's my files, and it puts it into a nice zip folder, easy to download, and I can just attach that zip and send it to whoever, or put it on a share for someone to access. So there's different ways to do that. You know, it could be that someone doesn't want the files put back into the original location because they may want to check the files, or they're a different version, you know. So having it being able to be pulled back as a zip file is a nice little enhancement that we can add into the product. So we've obviously got all the other capabilities in the product, you know, things like instant VM recovery and virtual standby. We also added in 6.5 the DR testing, what we call the assured recovery. So I can right click a server now and just say run an assured recovery test. I can also do this on a scheduled basis. and do a DR test. So this will spin up a copy of this machine as an instant VM into my vCenter, and you can do ad hoc tests as well as scheduled DR testing. And in my vCenter there, you'll see a server getting added in a minute, where it will just add it in, and it will spin it up into a VLab, make sure it's working, it makes sure it provisions, make sure it connects to the test network, and then shut it all down. So we've got automated DR testing now added into the product. So we've got that as well. And like I say, this update kind of covers three things really. It's some new features and enhancements that we've added around the backups, etc. So you can see now that that virtual standby task is getting done. So you can see there it's just added a UDP assured recovery of that VM into a test lab on there. And you'll notice on my server here that under configuration, under summary, you'll see that we've got a test subnet created called Arcserve for assured recovery, and the VM's getting spun up into that test subnet. So that's all going on in the background. So as I was saying, you know, the update 2 is a nice update, because what we do in development is when we get features and functions ready to be launched into the product, we don't just keep them back for a major release. We actually incorporate it into these updates. So it allows customers to get access to these functionalities sooner, but they're also an opportunity to recertify existing platforms to the latest releases of Linux, applications, databases, and there also are patches rolled into this. So it's like a service pack, a feature update, and a platform certification update all rolled into one update. So I'm going to kind of go back to the dashboard now in the console. I just wanted to show you some of that. And what I'm going to do now is go back to the presentation to answer any questions that you may have. So we're going to open this up for questions now, and I know the time is 11 o'clock, so the call's been on for just over an hour. So if you've got any questions, please use the questions panel, and I'm going to go through these now and answer as many questions. So if you have raised a question, I encourage you to stay on the line just for 5 minutes, give me a chance to answer, and we can take it from there. So thank you very much for your time. My name's Charlie Smith. I hope you've enjoyed today's session. If you want to email me, it's charlie.smith@arcserve.com. Happy to take questions offline if you don't want to raise it on the GoToWebinar questions panel. Alternatively, I have colleagues in, I have another 3 or 4 pre-sales colleagues in the UK. I also have colleagues in other parts of Europe. So if you're dialing in from countries outside of the UK, we can send you contact details for the local pre-sales people in your region or country to, if you've got any other specific questions as well. So thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed the session. I apologize for the interruption in the middle of the webinar where my GoToWebinar just seemed to bail me out, as it were, but I think I got back on track, which is the main thing. So thanks for your time, and have a great Friday and a great weekend when it comes. Thank you.